Hey everyone, ready to talk some hockey? I saw those articles you sent, and yeah, that Canada-Czechia game at the World Juniors, man, that was a wild one.
It really
It's
was.
a lot of controversy there.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know what, we need to do a deep dive on this one, and luckily I have, well, an expert right here to help us break it all down.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah.
You know what's so fascinating about this is it's not just a did they deserve to win or not.
Mm,
We're really talking about like the pressures of international competition, you know,
right.
officiating
Right.
and kind of how those things all collide
Yeah.
in a game with these stakes.
Well, okay, let's start with the basics. We
Yeah.
all know Czechia beat Canada 4-3 right?
Right.
And they got the game winner on a power play.
Yep.
Seemingly straightforward, right?
You would think so.
But the sources you sent, man, people are fired up about how that power play happened in the first place.
Right. And I think it's important to acknowledge the emotional side of this.
Right.
When your team loses, especially on a, what they would deem a controversial call,
Mm-hmm.
it's natural to feel frustrated.
Oh, yeah.
But let's try to separate the emotion from the analysis for a second.
Okay.
Were the calls against Canada really that bad?
Right.
Or is it just the sting of defeat talking?
Yeah. And, some fans, they're pointing to, well, they say a bunch of questionable penalties
Mm.
against Canada. Like one source I saw even broke it down into penalty minutes, Canada had almost double the penalty minutes of Czechia.
No.
And then there's that whole thing about missed calls that seem to benefit Czechia.
Right, and that's what everyone's talking about online.
Yeah.
And one specific incident that's been generating a lot of buzz is this missed call. On that flying elbow to the head of Canadian player Gavin McKenna.
Mm.
I rewatched the play several times, and it's definitely a borderline call. The ref might have had an obstructed view or thought the contact was incidental. But in real time, with the speed of the game, these judgments are incredibly difficult to make.
See, this is what gets me, right? Like, I get that reffing is tough.
Absolutely.
But when it's a potential elbow to the head, shouldn't player safety be the absolute top priority?
I mean, you would think so. And most officials would agree that player safety is paramount.
Yeah.
But it's not always so black and white. Imagine you're that referee.
Right.
You have milliseconds to make a decision.
Yeah.
You have to weigh the severity of the contact, the intent of the player, the potential impact of a penalty on the game.
Yeah.
It's a lot to process in a split second.
Yeah, no, I get it. Okay, but then there's that 5-minute major penalty given to Canada later in the game. 5 minutes. Yeah. Like playing shorthanded for that long is basically a death sentence.
Yeah.
So did that penalty really warrant that much time?
Yeah. That one was a bit more clear-cut, in my opinion.
Okay.
It was a boarding penalty, and the player went into the boards head first.
Oh.
Those are the kinds of plays the league is trying to crack down on.
Right. Yeah. Dangerous play. Gotta penalize it. Okay.
Exactly.
But still, 5 minutes? That feels like it, I don't know, tilted the game in Czechia's favor.
Yeah, it definitely had a huge impact. Even if the penalty was justified, the length of it is definitely debatable. 5 minutes is a significant chunk of a game, and it undoubtedly put Canada at a disadvantage.
Okay, so we've got the questionable calls, a potentially game-changing major penalty. And honestly, this officiating debate could be a whole deep dive on its own. But there's another layer to this controversy that we haven't even touched on. Team Canada's roster.
Yes. The pre-game debate that's now become the post-game inferno.
Right.
The source you shared specifically mentioned the absence of Michael Misa and Zane Perrick, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Misa was the OHL's top scorer,
Right.
and Perrick was considered, a highly promising prospect.
Exactly. You're telling me those guys wouldn't have made a difference in a tight game like this? Come on. So why were they left off the team? It just doesn't make sense.
Well, roster selection for Team Canada is notoriously tough. It's not simply about picking the best players on paper. It's about building a cohesive unit. Coaches consider factors like chemistry, playing style, and how individuals fit into the team's overall system.
Okay, so you're saying Misa, even though he was lighting up the scoreboards, maybe his style didn't mesh with what the coach was going for.
It's possible.
I can kind of see that, but still,
Yeah.
he was dominating. Like, how do you just ignore that kind of talent?
It's a tough call, no pun intended. You're right. It's hard to ignore a player with Misa's scoring prowess. But sometimes a coach prioritizes other aspects of the game, like defensive responsibility or a specific style of play. Maybe they felt they had enough offensive firepower already and needed to shore up other areas.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. But what about Perrick? He's a solid two-way player, so it's not like he's just an offensive liability. What's the logic there?
I think with Perrick, it might have come down to competition. That source you shared mentions a few other defensemen who were vying for those final roster spots, guys with similar skill sets. Maybe the coaches felt those other players were a slightly better fit for the team system, or they had a bit more international experience.
Okay, so we've got these roster decisions that are already raising eyebrows before the game even starts, and then you throw in the questionable officiating. It's almost like Team Canada was fighting an uphill battle from the get-go.
And that leads us to a really intriguing part of this conversation, the changing landscape of international hockey.
Yeah.
For decades, Canada has been the dominant force, especially at the World Juniors. But the gap is closing.
Wait, hold on. You mentioned that earlier
Uh-huh.
about how other countries are catching up to Canada in terms of skill and all that. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Absolutely. Look, for years, Canada benefited from having the best resources, coaching, and development programs. But other countries, especially in Europe, have been investing heavily in their hockey infrastructure. You see it in the NHL, too, with more and more European players making a significant impact.
So it's not just a fluke that Czechia beat Canada. They're legitimately a strong team now.
Exactly. This Czechia team was no pushover. They played a disciplined, strategic game, focusing on shutting down Canada's speed through the neutral zone, forcing them to dump and chase the puck. They didn't give Canada many clean entries, which disrupted their offensive flow. That's not just good luck. That's smart, tactical hockey.
Wow, I never thought about it like that. So it's not just that Canada is slipping up, it's that other teams are stepping up their game.
Precisely. The talent pool is getting deeper worldwide, and the days of Canada automatically being crowned champions are fading. And that's actually really exciting for the sport as a whole.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. It makes the tournament way more unpredictable, and every game feels like it could go either way.
Exactly. It's no longer a foregone conclusion that Canada will steamroll the competition. This Czechia game was a prime example of that. They outplayed Canada in several areas and earned that victory.
Okay, so we've got questionable calls, a debatable major penalty, roster controversy, and the rise of international competition. Is it just me, or is this starting to feel like a perfect storm of factors that all contributed to Canada's loss?
It's definitely a confluence of factors.
Yeah.
It's impossible to say for certain which element played the biggest role, but they all contributed in some way.
Right.
And this brings us back to that initial question, did the better team win?
Right. So after diving into all this, what's the answer?
Well, on paper, Canada might have had the more talented roster, but Czechia executed their game plan flawlessly, capitalized on their opportunities, and played with incredible discipline. So while the officiating might have played a role, it's important to acknowledge that Czechia deserved to win that game. They simply outplayed Canada.
Okay, so then that kind of brings up a whole other point, right? Like, if Czechia was playing that well, maybe the refs were, I don't know, subconsciously swayed by that. Like, maybe they saw Czechia outplaying Canada and it influenced some of those borderline calls.
It's definitely possible. There's this concept called expectation bias, where our pre-existing beliefs or expectations can influence how we perceive and interpret information.
Whoa, so you're saying that even if a ref is trying to be fair, those expectations could still creep into their calls?
It's a subtle but powerful phenomenon. It's not about intentionally favoring one team, but those split-second judgments can be influenced by external factors. And when you have an entire nation expecting one team to win, it's bound to create a certain level of pressure on the officials.
Man, that's wild to think about. It's almost like Canada's past success is working against them now.
In a way, yes. It highlights the challenges of officiating when the stakes are so high and the expectations are so heavily skewed toward one team.
Okay, so back to the game for a second. You mentioned earlier that other countries have been investing heavily in player development. What exactly does that look like on the ground?
Well, take Finland, for example.
Okay.
Your sources include an article about their new youth hockey program. It's all about skill development from a very young age. They're focusing on puck handling, creativity, and hockey IQ, not just size and physicality.
So it's not just about brute force anymore. They're embracing a more finesse-based style of play.
Exactly. And it's paying off. Finland has been consistently producing some incredibly skilled players who are making their mark on the international stage.
So these other countries aren't just trying to catch up to Canada, they're trying to surpass them with a different approach.
Absolutely. They're adapting to the evolving style of the game and focusing on developing well-rounded players who can excel in all facets of the game.
Okay, so we've got officiating, roster choices, and the evolving landscape of international hockey. It feels like we've gone from a simple hockey game to this whole philosophical debate about the sport. It really is fascinating to see how much depth there is to dissect from just one game. It's not just about the final score, it's about all these factors that feed into it. But I keep coming back to that flying elbow in McKenna. That just feels like it should have been a major penalty, and who knows, maybe it could have changed the outcome.
Yeah, it really highlights a real dilemma in officiating.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have player safety, which should always be paramount. On the other hand, you have the flow of the game, the severity of the infraction, and the potential impact of a penalty on the outcome. It's a tough balancing act.
Okay, so let's say you're the ref in that situation. You see a borderline play, it's not a blatant elbow to the head, but there's definite contact. It's late in the game, the score is tied, and a penalty could decide everything. What do you do?
Oof, that's the kind of call that keeps refs up at night.
Right.
There's no easy answer, and it often comes down to instinct and experience.
Wow.
In that moment, you have to weigh the potential risk to the player against the potential impact on the game.
Mm.
And knowing the scrutiny and backlash that comes with a controversial call, it's a lot of pressure.
And to make it even more complicated, you've got that whole Canada always wins narrative hanging over your head. Like, are refs subconsciously hesitant to make a big call against Canada because they don't want to be seen as, like, influencing the outcome?
That's a valid point, for sure. And it's something that officials at all levels grapple with, the perception of bias, even when they're trying their best to be impartial.
Right.
It's why transparency and accountability in officiating are so crucial.
Man, that's a lot to unpack. So before we wrap up, any final thoughts for our listeners, who I'm guessing are feeling a lot more informed about this game than they were before?
Well, first, I hope this deep dive has given them a deeper appreciation for the complexities of officiating.
For sure.
It's a tough job, and these guys are making split-second decisions under immense pressure. Let's try to give them the benefit of the doubt, even when we disagree with a call.
Okay, good point.
And second, let's remember that building a winning roster isn't as simple as just picking the best players on paper.
Right.
It's about chemistry, style, and creating a cohesive unit that can execute a game plan.
Yeah. And we saw, like we were talking about, there are other countries that are doing that really well now.
Exactly. And finally, it's clear that the landscape of international hockey is changing. Canada is still a powerhouse, but other countries are closing the gap. The talent pool is getting deeper worldwide, and that's great news for the sport as a whole.
Absolutely. So here's a question I'm going to leave everyone with. We talked about player safety and how it should be the top priority. But what if a ref sees a borderline penalty in the dying seconds of a tied game? A penalty that could decide the whole thing, but it wasn't a super dangerous play. Do they call it, knowing the backlash they'll face if it costs a team the win? Or do they let it slide, potentially putting players at risk?
That's the million-dollar question. And there's no easy answer. It's a judgment call that every official has to make, and it's one that comes with a heavy burden of responsibility.
Talk about pressure. Well, folks, there you have it, our deep dive into the Canada-Czechia controversy, officiating debates, roster decisions, and the future of international hockey. It was a wild ride, but hey, that's what makes the World Junior so captivating. Keep those conversations going, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.